There are silences that are just the absence of sound. And then there are the ones that have weight, that take up space, and breathe in the dark. For 3 years, the silence between me and my stepbrother, Logan, was the second kind. A living entity that resided in our room, on the invisible line that divided his perfectly tidy side from my contained chaos. I was 19, and felt like my whole life was a collection of spaces I didn't quite fit into. My mom and stepdad's house, my monotonous job at the hardware store, my own skin. But no space was as charged as that room. That night, the loudest sound I had ever heard was the soft, final click of the door lock. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to get access to more stories like this. My whole body froze. I was lying on my side, facing the wall, practicing the art I had perfected since moving in, pretending the world ceased to exist as soon as I closed my eyes. But my ears were on high alert, as always. I heard his footsteps on the carpet, slower than usual. I heard his breathing, a pause that stretched for an eternity. And then, the click. A small, metallic sound that sealed the room and shattered the fragile peace I was trying to build in my mind. My heart, which had been beating at a sleepy rhythm, bolted like a startled animal, hammering against my ribs. The air grew thick, hard to pull into my lungs. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to turn around, to ask what the hell he was doing. But fear pinned me to the bed. This was our routine. A silent, complex choreography. We woke up at different times to avoid meeting in the bathroom. We moved through the house like two ghosts who had agreed to haunt opposite rooms. I worked as a stalker at the local hardware store, a purgatory of identical aisles and the smell of cut wood and fresh paint. It was a job that required no thought, which was a blessing. It gave me hours to dissociate, to build walls inside my head, walls that crumbled as soon as I walked through the front door and felt his presence. Logan, at 24, already had a career. He was a logistics coordinator, something that sounded as stable and controlled as he seemed to be. He was order, I was entropy. His side of the room was a study in minimalism and precision. My things were always on the verge of spilling into his territory, and I lived in a state of constant vigilance to keep that from happening. The house itself was nice, a standard suburban home in Oregon, with a garden my stepfather obsessively cared for. But for me, the hallways were too long, the spaces too open. The only time I felt contained was inside our room, and that containment was suffocating. It was the epicenter of the tension. The air in there was always thin, heavy with everything we never said. Sometimes I could swear I could see the tension in the air, like the dust that danced in the beams of afternoon sunlight. We were experts at not looking at each other. Our gazes would cross by accident and pull back as if they'd touched something hot. A million words stuck in our throats, dying before they had a chance to be born. What you're hearing is just the beginning. The full stories, unfiltered and with all the details you can imagine, are available now. Check the link in the description right now. And now, the sound of that lock. An act so small and so violent. A complete break in our silent treaty. I felt the mattress dip. He hadn't gone to his bed. He'd sat on mine. My blood ran cold and then boiled, all at the same time. I could feel the heat of his body inches from my back. The wall I was staring at, with its bland plaster pattern, became the most interesting thing in the world. I focused on it, trying to merge with the paint, to disappear. The silence that followed the click of the lock was different. It was a silence with purpose, a silence that was waiting for something. Then, his voice, a hoarse whisper that cut through the air and pierced me like a blade. Alex. Just my name. But the way he said it, it sounded like a confession, an accusation, and a plea for help, all at once. I stayed motionless, breath caught in my throat. Maybe if I didn't answer, he'd think I was asleep. He'd leave, unlock the door, and in the morning we could pretend this moment never happened, storing it away with all the other things we pretended didn't exist. But he didn't move. I could feel his gaze burning into my back. I can't do this anymore, he continued, his voice even lower, broken. Pretending I don't feel anything when you're 3 feet away, breathing the same air as me. Pretending I don't spend every second aware of where you are in this room, in this house. The world stopped spinning. The words hung in the air between us, dangerous and iridescent. Each one was a truth I had pushed into the darkest corner of my own mind. I felt the same way. Every footstep of his upstairs, the sound of the shower, his silhouette passing the door. I was a satellite trapped in his orbit, and denial was the only fuel keeping me at a safe distance. And now, he had just said it. He had taken our fragile, constructed reality and crushed it with his bare hands. Courage, or maybe pure desperation, finally found me. I turned over slowly, the sheet twisting around my legs. The only light came from a streetlight outside, filtering through the blinds and casting pale stripes of light across his face. He was there, sitting on the edge of my bed, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles were white. His eyes, which I always avoided, were locked on me, and in them I saw a storm of emotions that mirrored my own: fear, desire, and a vulnerability so deep it took my breath away. His face, usually a mask of calm control, was undone. What are you saying?" I managed to whisper, my voice scratchy and weak. He let out a shaky breath, almost a sob. "I'm saying the silence is killing me, Alex. I'm saying I think about you in ways I shouldn't. That the reason I can barely look at you is because if I do for more than a second, I don't know what I might do." That was it. The final confession. The barrier broke, and a flood of 3 years of repressed tension washed over the room. There was nowhere left to run, no more lies to tell. It was just the two of us, floating in the wreckage of our old reality, the pale streetlight illuminating the truth in his eyes. I didn't say anything. I just stared at him, and for the first time, he didn't look away. In that moment, the room stopped being a prison and became the only place in the world where the truth could be spoken. And it was terrifying, and it was everything I had ever wanted. The days that followed that night were strange and floaty, like walking in a dream. The door was unlocked before dawn, but something fundamental had been permanently altered in the universe of our room. The silence returned, but its quality was different. It was no longer heavy and oppressive. It was electric, filled with particles of possibility and of vibrating fear. It was the silence of two tightrope walkers on the same wire, both terribly aware of the other's presence, of the chasm below, and of the magnetic pull between them. Our dance of avoidance became even more complex. Now, when we avoided each other's gaze, it wasn't out of indifference, but its opposite. It was an acknowledgement of the power a simple look now held. A look that lasted a second too long could set the air on fire, and we both felt it. The first test came 2 days later. My old car wouldn't start, and I was late for work. As I was cursing in the driveway, Logan appeared at the door, already dressed for his day, his own car keys dangling from his finger. "I'll take you," he said. It wasn't a question. His tone was neutral, but his eyes said something else. They were scanning me, searching for some kind of sign. The drive was a delicious torture. The space inside his car felt even smaller than our room. He turned the radio to some classic rock station, background noise for the silent symphony playing between us. I could feel the warmth of his thigh inches from mine. I focused on my breathing, on the pattern of the seat upholstery, on anything but his overwhelming presence. When we got to the hardware store parking lot, I hurried to get out. As I unbuckled my seatbelt, our hands brushed for a fraction of a second. An electric shock shot up my arm. It was tiny, accidental, but it felt like thunder in the quiet car. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. "Thanks," I muttered, not looking at him, and quickly got out of the car. I could feel his eyes on my back as I walked toward the store entrance. The interactions continued like that, small and loaded with meaning. One night, I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water, and he came in. We moved around the kitchen island in a careful orbit. Our shoulders brushed. Instead of immediately pulling away as we would have before, there was a hesitation, a half-second pause where the contact was held. It was enough to make my pulse race. In those moments I felt exposed, as if he could see right through my skin and read the confusion and desire boiling inside me. This new proximity, even in just glimpses, began to wear down my defenses. I found myself thinking about him constantly, replaying the accidental touch in the car, the brush of shoulders in the kitchen. The words he'd said that night echoed in my head on a loop. "I think about you in ways I shouldn't." I did too. And the guilt that should have come with those thoughts was muffled by a sense of inevitability, that we were being pulled toward each other by a force much bigger than us. But the scariest part was the hope. A small, dangerous seed of hope began to sprout in the wasteland of my chest. The hope that I wasn't the only one who felt like an outsider. The hope that the connection I felt wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tide turned. Logan started pulling away. It wasn't the old silence, the one of unspoken tension. It was something new, something cold and deliberate. He started leaving earlier and coming home later. When we were in the room at the same time, he busied himself with his laptop, headphones firmly in place, creating a fortress of sound around himself. The hesitant glances stopped. If our eyes met by chance, he was the first to look away, his expression becoming an impenetrable mask. The electricity in the air was replaced by a frigid vacuum. Every door he closed a little too loudly. Every one-word answer he gave me in the presence of our parents. Every time he actively avoided being in the same room as me, felt like a small blow. It hurt in a way the old silence never had. The old silence was a mystery. This was a rejection. He had given me a glimpse of what could be, of the truth behind his eyes, and then snatched it all away, leaving me more alone than ever. I didn't understand. He had risked everything to break the silence. Why? Why light a fire only to so carefully stomp it out? The confusion inside me began to curdle into anger. A cold, helpless anger. I felt like an idiot for letting that seed of hope sprout. He had locked the door, confessed his deepest feelings, shaken me to my core, and was now acting as if I were a complete stranger, an inconvenience in his perfectly ordered life. The pendulum had swung to the other extreme, and the silence now wasn't heavy or electric. It was just empty, and the emptiness was, by far, the worst of all. I was back at square one, but now square one was a much colder, darker place, because I knew what existed on the other side, and the absence of it was a constant, sharp pain. The wall of ice Logan built around us lasted a week. 7 days of a vacuum, of gazes that went through walls, and of a loneliness so palpable I could feel it in my throat. And on each of those 7 days, my hurt transformed, layer by layer, into a hard, cold anger. The anger of a fool who had allowed himself to hope. On the 8th night, the anger finally boiled over. He was sitting at his desk, as usual, the monitor's light bathing his face in an impersonal blue glow, his headphones serving as a declaration that he wasn't there. I shut the bedroom door, and the sound, a little louder than necessary, made him finally look up at me, his expression a mix of surprise and annoyance. "What was that?" I started, my voice steadier than I expected. He raised an eyebrow and slowly took off his headphones as if I were a tedious interruption. "What was what, Alex?" "Don't play dumb, Logan," I spat, taking a step forward. "That night, you lock the door, pour your soul out on our bedroom floor, and then spend a week acting like I have a contagious disease. What the hell was that? Was it a game? A test? Did you get bored and decide to mess with my head?" He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, a fortress of defensiveness. "You wouldn't understand." "Oh, I wouldn't understand?" I laughed, a bitter, joyless sound. "Try me. Because what I understand is that you pulled me to the edge of a cliff just to push me off. You made me feel like I wasn't crazy for feeling all of this. And now? Silence. Worse than before. At least before I didn't know what I was missing. I did it to protect you," he shot back, his voice rising for the first time. "To protect us. You're 19. You have your whole life ahead of you. Do you have any idea what we could ruin? For our family? For you? Then why say anything? Why not just keep up your perfect silence and leave me alone in my own misery?" I yelled, frustration burning behind my eyes. He shook his head, looking away, and turned back to his computer. "Forget it, Alex. It was a mistake. I shouldn't have said anything." A mistake? The word hit me like a punch. He was trying to erase it, to reduce that moment of raw truth to a simple slip-up. It was then that my eyes focused on his laptop screen. He hadn't minimized the window. It was a text editor, filled with paragraphs. And at the top, the file name, in bold, things I'll never say out loud. Docs. Time slowed down. My heart stopped hammering and began to beat in a slow, heavy rhythm. The title hung there. A lure. A key. Without thinking, moved by a force I couldn't control, I walked over to his desk. He didn't notice at first, lost in his own torment. I stood behind him, my body inches from his, and began to read over his shoulder. It wasn't just abstract feelings. It was details. Details about me. The way the morning light catches his hair when it's messy. The muffled sound of his laugh when he's watching something on his phone. And how I have to stop myself from smiling too. Today in the kitchen, our shoulders touched. It lasted less than a second. I felt it on every inch of my skin for the rest of the day. How pathetic is it to feel so much from so little? I hate him for making me feel this way. And I hate myself for wanting more. I read, and every word was a step inside his mind. A place I never imagined I'd visit. It was a diary of his obsession, a catalog of his torture. It was proof that the tension I felt wasn't one-sided. He felt it with an intensity that scared me and, at the same time, validated me in a deep, visceral way. There were whole paragraphs dedicated to fantasies, to scenarios where there were no barriers between us. They were described with such brutal honesty and a desire so palpable that the air in my lungs grew thin. I was reading his soul, and it was naked, bleeding onto the screen. Logan must have felt my presence, the heat of my body, my suspended breath. He stiffened, his shoulders tensing. He didn't have to turn around to know what I was doing. I felt a wave of shame for invading his privacy, but it was quickly swallowed by an even bigger wave of everything. Empathy, desire, a connection so intense it felt physical. He didn't try to close the window. He just sat there, motionless, defeated by my discovery. His fortress had been breached, his defenses pulverized. Everything he tried to hide with his cold silence was right there, exposed in the blue light of the screen. When I looked up from the monitor, my eyes were wet. I didn't feel angry anymore, just an overwhelming sadness for both of us, for all the time we'd spent hurting each other in silence. Slowly, I raised my hand. It was shaking. I rested it on his shoulder. His skin was warm under his shirt. He flinched at my touch, but didn't pull away. That touch, the first truly intentional touch between us, broke the spell. The room, once a battlefield, became a sanctuary. He turned in his chair, very slowly. His face was no longer a mask of control or anger. It was an open book of vulnerability. The fear in his eyes was still there, but now there was something else. A question he didn't need to speak, and I answered it. I leaned in and closed the distance between us. The first kiss wasn't gentle. It was a shock, a collision. It was desperate, hungry, the salty taste of tears. Mine or his, I didn't know, mixed with years of denied desire and repressed frustration. His hands came up and clutched my shirt, pulling me closer, like a drowning man grabbing onto a piece of driftwood. My hand slid from his shoulder to the back of his neck, my fingers tangling in his hair, holding him as if he might disappear. It was the breaking of a dam. All the resentment, all the pain from his withdrawal, dissolved in that contact. Nothing else mattered but the feeling of his lips on mine, the truth we were finally allowing to exist between us. We pulled apart, breathless, foreheads pressed together. His breath was as ragged as mine. "Alex," he whispered, my name sounding like a prayer. "Don't say anything," I answered, my own voice hoarse. "Not now." I pulled him by the hand, lifting him from the chair. He followed without hesitation. Our bodies seemed to move on their own, guided by an ancient, powerful instinct. Every movement was loaded with heavy meaning. His hands found my face, holding it with a gentleness that contradicted the ferocity of our kiss. His thumbs traced my cheeks, my lips, as if he were trying to memorize me through touch. What followed was a slow, reverent exploration. It wasn't a race, but the deciphering of a secret map we both knew by heart, but had never dared to touch. His hands slid down my back, mapping each vertebra through the fabric of my shirt. My hands found the hem of his, and I hesitated for a second before pulling it up, over his head. The sight of his chest, his skin, in the dim light of the room, was both shocking and perfectly natural. Clothes became barriers, shells that hid the truth now pulsing openly between us. They were removed, piece by piece, not with haste, but with the solemnity of a ritual. Every inch of exposed skin was new territory to be discovered. The heat emanating from him was intoxicating. The silence returned, but it was a silence unlike all the others. It was a silence filled with the sound of our deepening breaths, the rustle of sheets, the soft contact of skin on skin. Our bodies fit together with an ease that betrayed the complexity of our lives. It was as if two tides, long pulled toward each other across an ocean of distance, finally met on the same shore. The tension that had defined our existence for so long didn't disappear. It transformed. It converted into energy, into heat, into motion. We found a rhythm that was only ours, a wordless communication where every touch was a sentence, every sigh, a response. In that moment, in the sanctuary of our room, we weren't stepbrothers. We weren't our parents' sons. We were nothing but two bodies and two souls finally surrendering to a truth that was older and stronger than any rule or label the world could place on us. It was a complete surrender, an act of faith in the dark, and at the center of it all, a blinding clarity. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. When the storm finally passed, the quiet that settled in wasn't empty. It was full, heavy, like velvet. Our bodies were tangled together, limbs thrown over one another in a comfortable heap. The streetlight still cut the room into stripes, but now they seemed soft, almost protective. I was lying on my side, my head resting on his chest, and I could feel the thrum of his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm under my ear. It was the most comforting sound I had ever heard. The invisible barrier, the dividing line that split the room, had been erased forever. The air, once electric or frigid, was now warm and smelled of him, of skin, of us. I lifted my head a little to look at him. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep. One of his hands was in my hair, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my scalp. His face, in repose, looked younger. The chronic tension around his mouth and eyes had vanished, replaced by a softness I had never seen before. He opened his eyes and met mine. There was no panic, no regret, just a quiet, deep acknowledgement. He didn't have to say anything. In that look, I saw the same thing I felt inside myself, a relief so profound it was almost painful, and a sense of belonging that anchored me in a way I had never experienced. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel like a guest in my own life. I felt home. I slid my hand over his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin, the contour of his muscles. It was real. The fantasy I barely allowed myself to have, the images I guiltily pushed away, were pale and two-dimensional compared to the solid, warm, complex reality of this. The weight of his arm over my back, the texture of his skin under my fingers, the calm sound of his breathing. It was all real. We were real. "Logan," I whispered, just to feel his name in my mouth in this new context. He tightened his fingers slightly in my hair. "Alex," he answered, his voice a low, rough murmur. We lay like that for a long time, floating in that liminal space between passion and the dawn. My mind, usually a whirlwind of anxiety and doubt, was quiet. There was only the awareness of the present moment. The weight of our future actions, the complications that would surely come, were somewhere out there, on the other side of the locked door. But in here, in this cocoon we had created, there was only the simple truth of our touch. The truth that was written in that document, now made manifest in flesh and bone. He hadn't protected me from the world, as he'd tried to do with his withdrawal. He had given me a refuge from it, and I had done the same for him. In his vulnerability, I found my strength, and in my acceptance, he found his peace. The dynamic had shifted forever. We were no longer two opposing forces trapped in a small space. We were a center of gravity, and in the comfortable silence of that night, I understood that whatever happened next, we would face it together. The equation was finally solved. Time lost all meaning. I don't know if we lay there for minutes or hours, adrift in that sea of calm that followed the storm. Slowly, though, the awareness of the outside world began to creep in around the edges of our refuge. The distant sound of a siren, the hum of the small fridge in the hallway. They were reminders that our room wasn't an island, but a room in a house, on a street, in a city that continued to turn, indifferent to the revolution that had just taken place inside. It was Logan who broke the silence first, his voice a murmur so low it was almost lost in the fabric of his shirt, where my head still rested. "What now?" The question hung in the air, simple and immensely complicated. What now? It was the question about tomorrow, about the unlocked door, about breakfast with our parents. It was the question about everything that wasn't this moment of perfect clarity. I pushed myself up a little, propping myself on my elbows so I could look at him. The pale streetlight carved shadows on his face, and I saw the anxiety starting to creep back into his eyes. The weight of the real world was returning to settle on his shoulders. "What do you mean, what now?" I asked, though I knew perfectly well. He took a deep, heavy breath. "Alex, it isn't simple. We live under the same roof. With them." He didn't have to say our parents. The word hung between us, a tacit obstacle. What happened here tonight? It wasn't just a moment. It was a choice. And choices have consequences. I felt a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. Fear. There it was, an old acquaintance. But this time, there was something stronger to fight it with. The truth. "I know," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "You think I don't know? I can't be the one to ruin your life," he said, his voice tight with a sincerity that broke my heart. "I'm older. I should have been more responsible. I should have protected me." I cut him off, and there was a steel edge to my voice. "Logan, you don't get it. Before this, I wasn't living. I was floating. getting through the days. The job, this house, it was all background noise. The only time I felt real was when I felt your presence, even if it was just the tension of your silence. You didn't ruin anything. You woke me up. He stared at me, his eyes searching mine in the dark, looking for any sign of doubt. He found none. "We can't erase this," he said, more to himself than to me. "I don't want to erase it," I answered instantly. "Do you?" He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, the fight seemed to have gone out of them, replaced by a quiet resignation, an acceptance. "No," he whispered. "God help me, I don't." And that was our decision. It wasn't a detailed plan, or a list of rules. It was a silent agreement, sealed there in the dark. Our goodbye wasn't to each other, but to the loneliness we both carried. We said goodbye to the facade, to the pretense, to the agony of the almost. We decided to stay together in this new territory we had discovered. "But we have to be careful," he said, his hand finding mine, his fingers lacing with my own. The contact was an anchor. "No one can know. Not yet. Not out of shame. But to protect this." I finished the sentence and he nodded. I understood perfectly. What we had created was new, fragile, and incredibly precious. It was like a tiny flame in the middle of a windstorm. To expose it to the world now would be to extinguish it. We needed to build a shelter around it, to nurture it in secret, to let it grow strong and bright enough to one day, maybe, withstand the wind. Our secret wouldn't be a prison, but a sanctuary, our own private reality, woven into the spaces between the world everyone else saw. The emotion that flooded me was a strange and potent mix. There was the fear of what could happen, the vertigo of the height we were at. But above all, there was a hope so vast and blinding that it made everything else seem small. I was no longer alone in my orbit. I had found my son. The days that followed were a lesson in subterfuge and secret joy. The outside world didn't change. The routine of the house carried on as usual. The smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of the TV in the living room, the mundane conversations about the weather and work. But beneath that surface of normality, an electric current ran between me and Logan. A secret language we spoke without needing to open our mouths. Our new reality manifested in tiny details, invisible to anyone else. One night at dinner, my stepfather was telling a long story about a problem at work. I could feel Logan's knee brushing against mine under the table. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, gentle pressure, a message that said, "I'm here. I'm with you." I lifted my gaze and met his from across the table. He gave me an almost imperceptible smile, a glint in his eyes that lasted only a second but held an entire universe of meaning. It was enough to make my heart race, a warmth spreading through my chest. I dropped my eyes back to my plate, fighting to contain my own smile. In that moment, sitting at the dinner table with my family, I had never felt so much a part of a secret, so deliciously complicit. Our room transformed. It was no longer a minefield of tension. It became our refuge, the one place we could completely let our guard down. The nights were ours. The door, now always locked, was no longer a symbol of confrontation, but of privacy, of sanctuary. We would talk for hours, whispering in the dark, sharing fears, dreams, and stories from our lives before we knew each other. I learned that his control and order were an armor he built to protect himself from a world that often felt chaotic and scary. He learned that my detachment and silence weren't indifference, but a fear of caring about something I could lose. We were peeling back each other's layers, discovering the real people beneath the facades we presented to the world. And with every touch, every stolen kiss when we knew we were alone in the house, every shared glance that promised what would happen later, our connection deepened. It stopped being just about the overwhelming desire that had brought us together and became something calmer, stronger. It became care. It became trust. It became the quiet certainty that there was one person in the world who understood me completely. I changed. The feeling of being adrift disappeared, replaced by a sense of purpose. Waking up in the morning was no longer a chore. The job at the hardware store seemed less monotonous because it was just an interlude, a waiting period until I could come home, to him. I started to see beauty in small things. The way the late afternoon light streamed through our bedroom window, the sound of his breathing next to me in the dark. The world hadn't changed, but my perception of it had. It was like I was seeing in color for the first time. I know the road ahead of us isn't easy. There are a million obstacles we haven't faced yet, conversations we will one day have to have, and hearts we might end up breaking. The fear hasn't completely disappeared. It's just retreated to the shadows, a constant reminder of what's at stake. But now, the fear doesn't paralyze me, because I'm no longer alone to face it. I found my anchor in the most unexpected place. I found a home in someone else's heart. The silence that once separated us now binds us, a sacred space that belongs only to us. I don't know what the future holds, and maybe it's better that way. What I do know is that on that night, when Logan locked the door, he didn't trap me. He set me free, and I finally found my place. And it was, and always will be, next to him. What you're hearing is just the beginning. The full stories, unfiltered and with all the details you can imagine, are available now. Check the link in the description right now. Alex and Logan's journey is just beginning, and the biggest challenges are still to come. If you connected with their story and believe that love can be found in the most unexpected places, leave a like to show us your support. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss what happens when their secret is put to the test. Leave a comment telling us what you think they should do next.